Hello everyone, and this is BioPhoenix here, and today we're going to be taking a look at a PS1 game, and that happens to be Team Buddies. Now, before I start talking about the game, I have a pretty interesting story on how I found out about this one. So it was the year 2000, and I remember it was the same year that this game came out. And that was also the same year that I discovered the internet and all the possibilities that it can do. And there was one program that I had on my Windows 98 computer, and that happens to be WebShots. It's basically a program where you can get pictures off the internet and use them as your desktop background. So these days it's pretty useless, but back then I was quite amazed by this. So when I was a kid, I always used to look up random images of things that I knew about, mostly being video games and the very few anime and cartoons that I used to watch. And when I was looking up stuff about PlayStation, I remember finding pictures of this game. And it had my interest as a kid, considering this game had a lot of bright colors and also has a bunch of guns and shit, which is always fucking awesome. So I really wanted this game, but sadly we couldn't go out and buy games that often because we just couldn't afford it. So we mostly had to rent games. But renting this game as a kid was never easy because every time we went to the video store I'd always ask them about it, they just never had a copy of it in. But a few months have passed and eventually I actually saw the game sitting on the shelf, and well, as you know, I was pretty excited about renting it finally. But thinking about it now, I think I might know the reason why they didn't have a copy for so long is because the game wasn't even out at the time. Because this game came out in September of the year 2000, and I remember seeing the pictures of it in maybe late spring, early summer, so that's probably why. But anyways, that's enough of me and my nostalgic story here, so anyways, now let's start talking about the game. So Team Buddies was developed by Psygnosis and was published by Midway Games. And in Europe, it was published by SCEE. And it's a top-down strategy shooter. So let's take a look at the very simple story here, which is all about these buddies which roam around in a disco tent. So everything seems to be happy until a big giant gray thing flies over and drops a bunch of crates. I would assume it's probably aliens. So inside these crates are a bunch of weapons, and as soon as they carry them out, then they start shooting the everlasting fuck out of each other. And that's literally all you get for a story, just a bunch of Mighty Bean looking characters that start blowing up everything in sight. So yeah, not much to say here, but now let's start moving on to the gameplay. So at the same time as being a shooter, it's also a real-time strategy game, so meaning that it's not one of those real-time strategy games where you're just pointing and clicking on things. So you have a base and you start off with either one or two buddy characters, so you gotta pick up the crates and drop them off on a pad that is 2 by 2 by 2. So for an example, if you want to make a machine gun, you just gotta drop one box and then open it, or if you want to make an infantryman, then you gotta have two boxes stacked on top of each other in a corner. And if you want to make a tank, then you gotta make a cube. So essentially, making things in this game is very similar to making things in Minecraft. So once you build up enough buddies and equip them with different weapons and such, then you get to go out and destroy the enemy base. So that's the very basic of a deathmatch. But of course, if you're playing the main campaign, then you gotta do different missions. So for some examples of different missions that you get would either be surviving, taking out all the other teams, or even trying to defend a certain object, or bringing an object back to your base. And while some of these missions sound really easy, some of them are pretty difficult. But during your main missions, you also do get some optional missions that you don't have to do, but once you do them though, you do get a gold medal, and that also does unlock more things in the multiplayer. So yes, this game does have a multiplayer mode up to 4 players, which is pretty insane for the time. Well, for an action strategy game, that's quite a lot. Since there are other strategy games like Worms that can support up to 16 players, but of course that's just 16 players taking turns. So for the multiplayer mode, you have Deathmatch, then there's Domination, then there's Capture the Flag, and then there's Bomb Ball. And to sum up Bomb Ball, it's essentially a hot potato. But the multiplayer mode also isn't only just for multiplayer, you can also play it single player wise against the computers, which does make for some good practice. Because like I said, this game can be pretty tough, especially if you don't read any of the tutorials. So with that said, now let's start taking a look at the controls. I do think they are pretty good. So I think the overall layout is pretty easy to understand, like moving around, jumping, shooting, picking up the crate, or breaking them when they're on the pad, and cycling through your commands on what to build for your other teammates. And the feel of the walking in this game does feel pretty good, although whenever you're driving something, it does take some time to get used to turning around and such. Like, whenever you're driving around a tank, it does have that tank control feel, which, makes sense since you are driving a tank. But even if you're driving something like a bike, it still has that really stiff turning, which is kind of weird. But other than that, I really don't have much complaints about the overall controls. So I do think they are pretty good for a top-down shooter. So now, let's start talking about the other things, like the graphics. And I find them to be very nice looking for PS1 standards. So the game is very bright and colorful. In fact, that was actually one of the things that got me interested in wanting to play the game as a kid. And I just overall really like the art style to the game. And I really like the way that the characters look. In fact, they kind of look like Mighty Beans. Well, that's just if anyone remembers that toy line. But anyways, overall, I think this is still a very good looking game. And I'd say this is a good example of a 3D game on PS1 that has aged well, quote unquote. Although, even if this game didn't age well graphically, I'd still play it, considering I just want to play the game for it being a game, not just to look at. So now, as for the game's music, I think the music is pretty decent. So most of the game's soundtrack is techno music, and as you know me, techno is not my most favorite genre ever, but there is a few songs here and there that I really do like quite a lot. And I do think this game's soundtrack is very well composed, but sometimes the music is so subtle in this game, it kind of blends in with all like the noise that happens, whether it comes from like the explosions and just shit getting shot at. So I don't know if I'd say that it fully suits the game, but I do think it does suit the tone of it. But I don't have any real complaints about the music, like I don't think there's any bad songs on the OST, so with that being said, I do find that it is a pretty good OST, but I do think it could have been a little bit better, and maybe stand out a little bit more, but otherwise, I think it is fine the way it is. And as for the game's voice acting, there's not a whole lot I can say here, but I do think the voices that are in this game do suit it quite well. So most of the stuff that you hear from the voice work is a bunch of goofy one-liners, and some of them can be kind of funny. But as for the voice actors involved in here, I'm not too familiar with any of them except for one, and that happens to be Keith Wickham. And the role that I recognize him in is the Jester from Dragon Quest VIII, which is pretty interesting. So yeah, not a whole lot that I can say about the game's voice acting, but it does suit it quite well. Now, if you want to go out and buy this game, then be prepared to pay out your nose hairs. And it seems like this game has went up by quite a bit since last year, which is when I got the game. So there's some complete copies going for about $239, $220, and then there's 3 loose copies going for about $100, and finally there's a factory sealed one going for $400. Well, goddamn. So unfortunately, this game is really hard to come by, and even if you do see it around, it's gonna cost you a lot. But if you at least want to play the game, there is other options of course, but one thing I will say to help you all out is that if you're using the emulator EPSXE, then this game is just not gonna fucking work. I've tried many different options and I just never got it to work. And whenever I go on emulation forums, it seems like a lot of people also have this issue and no one seems to give a straight answer. Well, I'm here to help, because how you play this one on an emulator is that you have to use PSXFin. And that's the emulator that has the awesome boot up screen. And the game runs perfectly on there, no issues whatsoever. So I hope that helps you out if you do want to try this game out. Since it's perfectly understandable that not everyone is going to pay $200 for this. So now, as for my overall thoughts on this game, I still think this is a really awesome game. So even after all these years, this game is still very enjoyable. And I really do like the unique concepts that it has. Like building up your guys and building your weapons is kinda cool, and the many variety of missions are quite fun, even though some of them are very frustrating at times. But they do feel really good after completing them. And the multiplayer is a hell of a good time. In fact, me and my sister actually used to play this game with 2 players, and it was really fun. Although I never played it with 4 players back then because I didn't have the multi-tap, I would imagine it would get pretty crazy hectic, which would be pretty awesome. So how could you go wrong with just blowing up a bunch of random shit? To answer that simply, you can't. Because this game is just all about the fun. You don't need to have a crazy epic story to have a great game. So if you really like strategy games and you also like a whole lot of action, then I can definitely recommend this one. So that's it for Team Buddies, so with that being said, thanks for watching and commenting, and have yourselves a great day.
See you in hell, dinner plate.